So, if we weren't already, we surely have become a lot like the Man in Black, racing to figure out this maze of a show before it reaches its conclusion. And in preparation for that conclusion, this week's episode actually spent much of its running time looking back, focusing on the memories of its characters, human and host alike, specifically those involving pain and loss. And in that area, I did find this episode to be quite engaging. For example, it was just heartbreaking watching Bernard being forced to let go of Teresa, being made to forget the same part of her that had kept the memory of his son alive in his synthetic mind. Pain. And more than that, it was so intriguing to watch him cling to that pain, even as Ford eradicated it from his mechanical mind. The piece being downloaded into his conscious mind, for a moment anyways, seemed unable to touch the despair in the deepest recesses of his subconscious. And the idea that pain not only kept that memory alive, but was also the very thing that made Bernard alive, seemed to fall perfectly in line with the show's often presented philosophy that change can only occur and a loop can only be broken through violence and the spilling of blood. And the idea that the experiencing of pain and violence really were what made a human was what made Maeve's character so very interesting this week. Of all of the hosts, she really seemed to be the only one ready to transcend her creators, to move past that which made them human, and to be more. And though that had begun to take shape in weeks past, as she, for example, had her intelligence boosted beyond that of a human, this week she really advanced by confidently seeking to leave behind her memories of pain, understanding them to be nothing more than falsities used to keep her on her puppet master's string. She was now ready to write her own story, moving past merely controlling Felix and Sylvester to controlling all of her fellow hosts. Ironically, Maeve remained a lot more like her human counterparts than she likely preferred by not only using, but inciting violence and pain to aid in her revolution. Furthermore, when it came down to it, just like Bernard, she had to admit that she didn't really want to let go of the pain of losing her daughter, understanding that it was the only thing really left of her. Fittingly, it was the painful recollection of the Man in Black's violent attacks that finally jogged Teddy's memory as well, beginning to awaken in him where he had been and who he really was. But even while each of those androids seemed to take a few more steps towards consciousness, Ford's opinion on the matter all but crushed the idea that consciousness existed at all. In his apparent estimation, neither hosts nor humans possessed it. Though I do say apparent because he, at the top of the episode, still chose to converse with Bernard, electing to behold his heartbreak and desiring to study his grief, instead of just immediately erasing his memory. And that told me that, whether he admitted it or not, Ford still questioned what made him alive and sentient. And though I could be reading far too much into it, this episode may have actually told us why Ford was still searching when he quipped to Charlotte, "You're wasting time that I don't have." To me, that implied that he was dying, and therefore needed to prove something about himself to himself before he did. The reason that his newest story wouldn't be, as he put it back in episode 4, a retrospective, was because he wanted to break free from his loop, demonstrating before his death that maybe, just maybe, he possessed consciousness and a soul. Additionally, even as Ford said to Bernard, God has nothing to do with it, he still seemed conflicted or at least unresolved in his view of the divine. After all, Bernard's existence had everything to do with his creator, Ford, and he only existed because every part of him had been intentionally and purposefully designed, so couldn't that then be a paradigm for Ford's and indeed all of creation's existence as well? Even so, the writers did do their best to separate man from machine this week, again, specifically in how they responded to memory. So, after being presented example after example of the synthetic memories within the hosts, memories that informed their every action, the writers then focused on the authentic memories within the human characters. But instead of those painful memories pushing someone like the Man in Black towards empathy and love, his refusal to be affected by them only demonstrated how detached and numb he really was. Ford had sought to fill his hosts with all the shades of emotion between love and hate, but neither he nor the Man in Black really seemed capable of experiencing even those extremes. They had replaced them with their obsessions, seen clearly in Ford's quoting of Frankenstein. "One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of the knowledge I sought, for the dominion I should acquire." Ford had become so consumed by the beauty and art of what he had created that he was willing to murder Teresa and Elsie for it, because to him, this was all just a story, and I loved the look that Charlotte gave Ford after he let that calloused outlook slip out just a little too much by saying of Teresa's death, "It's a disappointing end to her story, isn't it?" Interestingly, I felt like we may have seen William's first step into that calloused world this week as well, as he, while Dolores' back was turned, may have murdered that dying soldier so that he wouldn't hold them back from the next stage of their journey. Like Ford, and I'm assuming his future self, William was becoming obsessed with the story no matter what the cost. Ironically, this week it was the much less likable Logan who actually made what this show would define as the much more human decision, hunting down William and Dolores because of the memory of their violent and painful parting. To return to the hosts' memories a moment longer, what I found to be the most interesting element of this episode was just how they perceive memory. For them, the images that they recalled were in fact as clear and as vivid as those directly in front of them, making it nearly impossible to differentiate between their mind's eye and their naked eye. And because of that, I have begun to hope, mind you, as this theory is already riddled with holes, but I have begun to hope that what we've perceived to be this whole time to be flashbacks will actually turn out to be flash forwards. And the confusion that the Dolores who's been traveling with William has been feeling has not been because she's been seeing the past, but because she is in the past being remembered by her future self. Either way, the existence of numerous timelines continued to be telegraphed this week with the reappearance of Angela in a drastically different environment, and that we've been watching a now and a then was certainly declared in lines like, "Best not to dwell on these troubling memories, Bernard. Otherwise you might lose yourself in them as some of your fellow hosts have, every now and then." Also, the answer to where Maeve will get her army seems to have been overtly answered with the constant reminders of that sea of decommissioned hosts. With all that said, Westworld has been able to keep me wondering about a few things. For example, I still don't know what exactly are the rules of Westworld and how much control Ford is really maintaining over his creation. Because elements like a terrifying horned-dressed man tossing the man in black around like a ragdoll seemed, in the moment, to be extremely out of control. But then, in the next scene, shown the exact same outfit conceptually designed and safely mounted in one of Ford's offices, we also seem to be told that that host was only doing what he was allowed to do. Even so, I remain curious if we were meant to be satisfied with the Man in Black's explanation that neither Teddy nor any host could leave on him a lasting mark. Because I personally would classify getting knocked out and likely receiving a concussion as a lasting mark. And right along with that, we saw that Sylvester's was not the first throat that Maeve had slashed either, as she certainly inflicted a lasting mark on the Man in Black after he murdered her daughter. Before I close things out, I must admit that even while I enjoyed this episode's exploration of memory, in a lot of ways it also made what is a 10-episode season feel like it should be an 8-episode season, as most of the big moments and major reveals were just delayed, and the ones that were doled out felt relatively inconsequential. So this was the episode, for example, where Maeve's mind was wiped. But actually, it wasn't, and this was the episode where Sylvester's throat was slashed, but then cauterized, so that it could be cut again at a later date. And this was the episode where Dolores finally found her home, a place that we'd seen both in the past, the town where Ford and Arnold had trained their hosts, as well as the present, the location where Ford would, at least in part, construct his new storyline. A place that seemed like it would be the end of Dolores's, if not everyone's, journey, only to have her and William quickly leave it without having learned that much more about it. And even if it will be where everyone's paths converge, this week it was just presented as another piece of the puzzle instead of the cover of the puzzle box. Those are my thoughts anyways on this week's episode of Westworld. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I do apologize that this week's review was out just a little bit late. I had a wonderful, glorious bout of food poisoning on Monday, so that is why this is out just a little bit later. Nonetheless, I would still love to know what you guys thought of this week's episode, though, so definitely comment below and let me know. And finally, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.